And so to talk a lot more about this name change, I want to bring into the conversation now Brian Sobel, political analyst. Brian, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Of course, we know we've been tracking a lot of what's happening there, but let's start with the very basics. In case some folks aren't familiar with the War Department, Department of War, where did this all initially stem from here in our country?
Well, as the package that was just shown indicates, this was a bill signed into law by George Washington and 158 years ago. Or rather, well, 158 years ago until today, it was the War Department up until 1947. When President Harry Truman, changed it over to the Defense Department. And I think if one goes back into history, which I'm wont to do, you see that that was in the aftermath of the most catastrophic world war in history, any war in history. And I think it was to try to begin a process of not focusing on war, but more focusing on peace. And I think the current president, Donald Trump, who believes in peace through strength, believes that the name War Department needs to be brought back. So again, it's been Department of Defense since 1947. But previous to that, going back to George Washington, it was the Department of War.
And so it's interesting to see how some of these changes might potentially be made. But we heard there one of those critical points. They were talking about the fact that whether or not this will be done, it takes an act of Congress. Can you speak to that a bit, Brian?
Yes. Yes, it does take an act of Congress. The question of whether the votes are there, I think because there are a lot of Republicans in Congress and not many would object probably to a rebranding, which I think this really is, of the department. I think they'll go along with it, and that's essentially what the president said. But you know, people look at names and connotations and decide whether the idea of going from a more passive Department of Defense to a more aggressive Department of War at this time in our history is the appropriate thing to do, and I'm sure that it will have its critics.
And Brian, and so as we're looking at some of this video footage from this happening there in the Oval Office yesterday, we know that President Trump is one for some of these name changes. I mean, off the top of my head, I can easily name the Fort Bragg, Fort Liberty conversation that happened as well. Once he came back into office, President Biden had renamed what was Fort Bragg at the time to Fort Liberty. But that initially changed as soon as President Trump came back into office with the second administration, also going to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Why does he see some of these name changes, or branding, if you will, important for how our country is looked at?
I think he looked at a lot of these name changes as weakening the warrior ethos and the military in general. Under the previous president. I mean, some of these base changes were as a result of the specter of the Confederacy, and some of these names of posts, especially in the South, were named after Confederate generals. And I think in an attempt to kind of deal with issues like DEI and other things, the previous president went along with name changes. And in some cases, you looked at it and said, okay, Fort Benning, as an example, changed to Fort Moore, named after General Hal Moore, a fellow I knew. I knew Hal Moore. I interviewed Hal Moore numerous times. And so you say, okay, well, that's okay. Hal Moore was the hero of the Ia Drang Valley during Vietnam. But in other cases, it looked like just essentially name changes to erase history in the past. And I think Donald Trump comes along and says, we need to reestablish the names, the statues, the Department of War as an effort to bury some of these efforts to minimize the contributions of a lot of people, and some contributions which we don't agree with.
And so I'm going to put this up on the screen as well as we're looking at that video footage. This was happening, Brian, simultaneously as the announcement was being made. They had these folks, or at least showed and released the video of these folks taking down those letters there, showing the Department of Defense, then changing it to the Department of War. I want to put this up from the Secretary, Pete Hegseth, as well. He put this on his X account saying, the motto of my 1st Infantry Platoon was, those who long for peace must prepare for war. The War Department will be prepared every day and in every way to ensure our citizens live in peace through strength. That's one of those things that you already have brought up in this conversation. But I have to ask you, Brian, when we're looking ahead, do we think that anything will fundamentally change within how the department goes about its activities? Or is it going to be the same as what we're seeing, just underneath a different name?
I think it's the latter, Christina. I think the Department of War now will conduct its business the same way it did as the Department of Defense. I saw a couple of critics saying that, this signaled to the Chinese and the Russians a new posture and that sort of thing. Chinese and the Russians don't care what we call our Defense Department or War Department. Their aim is to be, in the case of China, the global leader militarily. And so the idea that we're sending a certain signal to Russia, China, Iran is, to me, a non-starter. It doesn't send any signal at all. They already know about our defense posture, our ability as a nation, by the way, to wage war, which is singular in the world. It is the best in the world. They already know that. For them, a name change, a rebranding doesn't matter. But when one studies the history of war, which is part of my background as a military writer, author of a book on the famous General George S. Patton and his son, who was also a general, by the way, called The Fighting Pattons. You learn as you study military history that some things don't ever change and should not change. The military ethos, the ability to wage war for a superpower is undeniable. It has to be in place. And I think the whole effort here by Donald Trump and the new Secretary of War and formerly Secretary of Defense is to, again, rebrand in a way that everybody in the Department of War now understands that there's a new mentality, not on defense, but on offense.
I have to ask, you brought up something that I found interesting, talking about whether or not other countries care about the naming. Are you aware of any other countries around the world that call theirs the War Department as well when it comes to the defense and the strategies that they employ when it comes to interacting with other countries?
Not as directly as this, but you also have to consider that a lot of these countries around the world have undergone fundamental changes. The Soviet Union, as an example, is now Russia, and the other parts of the old Soviet Union are like Ukraine, and so the world has changed there, and so that's true around the world. I always remind people that the oldest constitution or charter of government in the world is the United States Constitution. So we have 250 years of continuity. A lot of these other countries around the world, and certainly in the aftermath of World War II and World War I, changed dramatically. The geography, the topography, even the languages that were imposed upon people in certain regions during World War II changed the complexion of those countries. And so we've had a long and successful run. And so again, I wouldn't make too much of what is being done here today, but it is a rebranding by the president to remind our military and the American people that, again, we want to not be defensive in this very troubled world, but we want to remain on the offense.
And it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out. Those moments happening yesterday in the Oval Office as the camera pans there. You can see the top 3 of those military leaders, of course, with the president being the commander-in-chief, but the new Secretary of War standing next to him, Pete Hegseth. We'll continue to watch as this unfolds. We appreciate, as always, Brian Sobel, our political analyst that we talk to often here, for breaking down the very latest.
My pleasure, Christina. Have a great rest of your Saturday.
You too. Have a great weekend.